Let's officially start with the game. So you can see my opponent's rating, but before the round started, I actually prefer to not look at my opponent's rating because that way I don't play to their rating. I don't get myself in a certain mindset of, oh, this person is higher or lower rated than me, so that means I'm going to win or lose or anything. So I didn't find out until afterwards that my opponent was rated 1700. And I was playing as white. I played d4, and my opponent plays f6, knight f6. And I was assuming from this setup that we were going to enter a Nimzo type situation where there's a bishop and a knight goes here, and maybe you try kicking the bishop. So imagine my surprise when I got to play Queen's Gambit Declined. And I was so excited about this because in the Cramling course, this is the variation I have invested the most time into studying for d4. And Pia Cramling in particular recommends the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit Decline. So I take the pawn here, he takes back, e takes d5, and then bishop g5 to pin the knight. This move surprises me a little bit. I understand why he made it. It prevents my bishop from coming out as far as it wants to. And this knight still has squares it can go to. But I also clocked the fact that this pawn getting committed to c6 means that the knight can't go there, and if I can somehow cut off this diagonal from the bishop, this bishop is not well placed. So I close the pawn chain, and he kicks my bishop immediately. And in Queen's Gambit Declined, in this positional line, you do not want to exchange the bishop for the knight. You just do not, unless you are absolutely forced to. So he unpins his knight by bringing the bishop out, and I make an inaccuracy here. I play knight f3, which actually does land me in a little bit of a problem in a moment. A stronger move here would have been bishop d3, and the reason it's stronger is because it helps to control the f5 square so that black's bishop can't land there. But I played knight f3 to add protection here because I wasn't sure if there was any kind of discover attack situation. Artisan asks, what's the stockfish evaluation? Right now it's dead equal. It's plus 0.2 to white. And after knight f3, it's 0-0. So it's very negligible here. So it's the difference is 0.2 difference. It's not a huge issue. But the reason that it gets a little troublesome for me is not because my opponent takes advantage of this square still being available, but this knight does have a nice outpost to land on. I'm using proper Krishna. And if the knight lands on e4 with my knight on f3, I can't kick it easily. So his knight comes out, and I do actually get to put my bishop on its best square, because look at how much space my bishop has eyes on. My bishop is so delicious on d3. I'm very excited for how much space I'm having from this opening. He castles, I castle. And he brings a rook to the semi-open file. And I spent a little bit of time on this next sequence because I have two candidate moves. Usually when a rook moves, there's an idea to match the rook to try to keep control of the file, you know, kind of split between the two sides. But the other idea in these Queen's Gambit declined positions is to bring the queen to c2 to have the light squared bishop and the queen coordinating together and giving a check on h7 with the bishop to force the king to move once the knight is gone. That's an idea to keep in the back of your mind. So that is what I play. I play queen c2, which is the best move. And at this point in time, we see the knight jump to this kind of annoying square for me. And at this point, and only at this point, do I finally accept that my dark squared bishop is going to die. But that's okay for me because my pawn chain is on dark squares. My opponent won't have the bishop pair either. So from a positional standpoint, this is a fine trade for me. So he takes with the queen, and this is the first move I spend a lot of time on. This is move 12. The game is still equal. It's 0.2 in my favor. And my moves that I was considering between are the ideas from the Cramling course. There's one idea in the Cramling course to bring a rook to b1 and start a minority attack on the queen side. There's another idea in the Cramling course that is to bring the rook from the A file all the way over to the E file. And I felt in my gut that was the right move, even though it means that this rook has nowhere to go. And so I was like, do I do it? Do I make this commitment? Because this commitment means my F rook is stuck. But the reason this move is a good idea some of the time is eventually these pawns will start marching towards the center. And the rook on F becomes a big asset to help support the F pawn. So that's what I did. And immediately I thought I had made a mistake because my opponent makes this really great move. This is best move, b6. And I thought to myself, oh no, I've just doomed my rook to being a target by the bishop. You'll be shocked to know that rook from A to E1 is the best move. It is the best move. So I correctly pinpointed the correct plan in this position. Sicilian guy 96, thank you for the follow. A lot of times people hesitate to let the castled rook stay there. Yes, so at this point, because my pieces are developed, Sicilian guy, you helped us reach our follower goal. Thank you. 740, that's crazy. And so I had a pretty solid plan that I was ready to launch. And the extra juicy part of this plan is the queen is leading the battery for black on the E file, whereas I have a rook leading. So keep that in mind because this is going to be something my opponent has to account for. So that's right, he had played b6, and this move I made because remember how I was very annoyed by the knight outpost? I wanted to make that knight leave me alone. This move was excellent, and I gladly would accept a trade of either knight here because their knight is way stronger than either of my knights. So trade me, please, and thank you, and then I can start chipping away at the center. You remember similar plans in my course? Yes, I was so stoked that we made it to move 12 in book, according to the chess.com book notation. But still, it is dead equal in this game. It is 0-0. So he decides to take my knight on c3, and I had to think about how do I best recapture the knight? Do I take it with the b pawn or do I take it with the queen? I really liked the fact that my queen and my bishop were supporting each other. So I decided to take with the B pawn, even though that means I have an isolated A pawn to his 4 pawns on the queen side. It was a choice I decided on. Engine thinks that they're about the same, but the better move actually would have been to take with the queen here. So this move is interesting to me because if you'll think back a move, Black's light squared bishop compared to my light squared bishop, this is a very sad piece. It has no scope this way because look at my d4 pawn, completely preventing the knight from making forward progress, and the knight can't even make progress this way because I'm controlling light squares and I could very easily control g4. Was the best move a5? Let's see. Best move here is knight f6. So it does think bringing the knight out to give bishop development scope this way is a better plan, because the other problem with the bishop landing on b7 is it's biting on granite, as Donnie would say, is the c and d pawns for Black have to move a lot in order for the bishop to be doing any work here. But I am curious if this works. I haven't explored that. No, that's a mistake because I can play e4. So it's too slow. It's too slow. So opponent plays bishop b7 in the game, and guess what move I actually play here? e4. And the reason I play e4 is I realize that this knight can't make progress. And this was my first kind of Karpov-inspired move because I was thinking to myself, I have more space in this position. All of my pieces can see more squares than my opponent's pieces, so I'm not looking to trade anything. All I want to do is ever so slightly suffocate the life out of my opponent while making my stuff better. And that's what e4 accomplishes. And now we can see why the queen being on e7 is kind of a problem for Black, because there are scopes on the queen. I do need to be pretty mindful though, because I haven't made a luft. So Joe, hello, suffocate the life out of them. Yes, that is the Karpov way. And that was my mantra in this game. I was like, I will slowly make it so you cannot breathe. And Amuser, yes, if they can sack the queen for 2 rooks, that is a massive idea in this middle game section, because if my knight moves from d2 and this file opens up, I have back rank issues. So he takes, and I realize I don't have to be in a rush here, because as long as I can take care of my queen to not allow for this pawn to eat and threaten promotion, I still have the scopes. So I take with my bishop, and I thought this was an interesting move from my opponent, but it is a mistake according to the engine. So if we go back a move, he spent a lot of time here, and the reason he moved his king was to prevent any discovered attacks this way. Or like Artisan is saying, I actually can just keep on eating pieces because of this. But he does move the king, and I spent a lot of time here because I saw that this was still on the table. And like Amuser is saying, I did not love the fact that so for example, if I were to play bishop takes c6, then queen takes, and what I didn't calculate correctly in the game was I can actually take the bishop here first, and then queen e6, and I can win a rook this way. So my bishop just goes on a Pac-Man eating spree. What I thought would happen in the game was, for some reason, I thought I was forced to take the queen, which is terrible because then, check, I have to block with the knight, take, and my opponent is up a piece. So this was a mistake because it does allow that bishop eating Pac-Man style on the long diagonal, but I didn't spot that. I only spotted eating the pawn and then a huge bad trade for me on the e-file. So I didn't play best move. I played rook e3, planning to create my own battery with slightly less valuable pieces. This was a miss, but it's still, the evaluation bar is still pretty equal. It's plus 0.4. We've never, this was the only move where the evaluation bar has gone beyond 1. This is about 1.2. But I missed it. And now the queen finally removes herself from her pin situation. And I finish creating my own rook battery. Could be a nice daily puzzle. That's interesting. I don't know how you get in touch with chess.com about that, but yeah, that's a great idea. And so my opponent puts his rook on e7, preparing his own rook battery. And this next move, I really like this next move. Bishop slides back to f3 because I realized at this point, remember, strangling the life out of my opponent. Their light squared bishop, this pawn is trapped because if the pawn moves, this light squared bishop has no support and I would get it for free. And this pawn is still preventing the knight from jumping in and causing any problems. So I wanted to keep my bishop on this really nice long diagonal, playing how I should with an isolated pawn. Yeah, the queen side is shut down. Black has nothing here. Just absolutely nothing. I am controlling this game. Black is merely trying to survive. And to be fair, my opponent is playing great. He is defending like a champ. I am trying to make these inroads, trying to carve it out, and he is just meeting me punch for punch. So I play bishop f3, this is best move, and he adds another rook to the battery, and I spent a really long time here. My opponent was, he was an adult, probably older than me, maybe his 40s? I don't know, I always feel weird guessing adults' ages because I don't know. Anyone older than me is older than me. Anyone younger than me is a teenager. No, I kid. But I spent a lot of time here because I tried to think to myself, okay, we're both developed. There's a ton of pressure on the e-file. I still have back rank issues I need to be mindful of, so my knight can't move. Or at least that's what I was thinking, because if my knight moves and there's an exchange here, then I have 3 kind of pathetic pawn islands rather than a little rogue boy, a 2 and then a 3. And I didn't want that. So I decided to go for a big trade here, especially because my opponent was meeting me punch for punch. If we could simplify the position with his pieces still not having as much space as mine, I thought I had decent chances entering an endgame. Hello, Prof. You think Queen h7 looks spicy? You're right on the money. Queen h7 is the best move. I was nervous about playing Queen h7 because I thought that there was counterplay. Actually, I don't know if I thought about this in the game. Let's explore it. Queen h7 is best. Black's best response here. Knight f6. Queen h8 is the best follow-up, and then knight blocks. Oh, look at this poor suffocated king. And then from here, bishop e7, followed by g6, knight c4, queen f6. So basically forcing a trade here. No, not forcing a trade. What? Queen is, yeah, so queen h7 was the best move. I missed this. This isn't what I got played in the game. But to Amuser's point, the queen kind of gets stuck. Even in the best line, according to the engine. And I don't want my most powerful piece out of play. I also didn't see this line. So instead of queen h7, I decided, let's relieve the tension. So I took, which it was inaccurate because it wasn't the best idea. And we trade everything down. And I say, trade me, please. Trade me. Because then I feel like I have potentially better chances. That's not true. Black should have traded here. Because I thought that the 3 connected pawns versus my disconnected pawns, I didn't think this was a huge problem because there's no pawn that's technically passed. All of my pawns can fight these pawns if needed, and my bishop is still much stronger than this bishop. But still equal. The game is dead equal. It has been this entire time. We've just been butting heads. But he doesn't take. He brings the queen to a3, which I think is a really great move to try to have some counterplay on the queen side, which up until this point has been a very dead party. So I drop my queen back to c2 to protect a2 and c3 at the same time. Both of these pawns are kind of vulnerable, but taking stock of the position once again, this pawn is a huge weakness because its only protection is a bishop who has no defense. And the knight can't come forward to defend because of my d4 pawn, which I have been so mindful about not moving. I've been really trying to improve my pawn play and thinking, what is my pawn currently doing? Do I want it to do a different job? Because it can never go back to doing the same job it did before. My opponent tries to get a little bit more space on the queen side with b5. And I finally have time to make myself a lift. I was so freaking nervous this whole game that I would get back rank mated. Every single move I was calculating, okay, my knight has f1, I'm fine. My knight has f1, I'm fine. But that takes an entire piece to babysit a square. And I need my knight to have more active play. Grandmaster advice, the pawns do not move backwards. Yes, exactly. And I was trying to live that advice to its fullest. My opponent thinks a while and starts to try to make his pieces better. What about g3 instead of h3, by the way? Yeah, g3 is slightly better. I thought about g3 in the game because my bishop is protected. But I need to learn, actually. This is a study point for me of when to push the G pawn versus when to push the A pawn or H pawn to make a lift. Because to me, I thought because my opponent has a light squared bishop, I didn't love the idea of this diagonal potentially somehow getting eyes open, which is why I went with the H pawn instead. But it's about the same evaluation wise. How much better? Yeah, it's calculating. Okay, it's a 1/10 of a point difference. Slight preference for g3. At this point in time, though, I have a 0.5 advantage, so I have about half a pawn extra. And now I have about 0.4 advantage. And so my opponent starts to bring his knight to a more active square, although take a look at what squares the knight actually has access to. Can't go here, can't go here, can't go here. But I thought to myself, okay, I don't really care about this knight being here, But I want to make my knight better now that it doesn't need to babysit f1. So I play knight b3, and I could tell right away my opponent wasn't expecting this. This is best move. And the reason that knight b3 is so strong is it creates some threats. Like, it's just a very powerful square for my knight to get to. And also, look at my opponent's queen. Remember, smothering, suffocating, slow death. This queen is running out of squares. So I am trying to make my opponent's pieces basically as crappy as possible while making my pieces as good as possible. And he decides to go back with his knight. And the reason he goes back with his knight is to cover c5, so my knight cannot jump into that square. And I make one of my only mistakes of the game. I bring my knight back as well. Not a huge mistake. In this position, the eval bar is 1.3. And here we're back to 0.5. So I could have, I think, won a pawn somehow. Here's the line I should have followed. I should have brought my queen out to attack the knight. And I considered this in the game, but I didn't love the fact that their queen... Our robots, not Cramling. Yeah, this Anna. Not the Cramling Anna. Who's she? So this was the best move. I didn't play this. But here's what I was thinking. I was worried about queen takes a free pawn here, which is actually a blunder, and I didn't spot this in the game. I spotted that we could change knights here, and in Muser, that's what I missed. I missed the mate threat if the queen gets to d8. Completely missed it. I thought that my opponent would have counterplay with checks and then get to eat my pawns, and so that's why I didn't end up playing that. Instead of queen takes a2, another option I was worried about is, okay, what if the bishop decides to protect the knight so there's some kind of discovered attack this way? That's also not a problem, because in this case, the bishop can just take the pawn that's now undefended. And I have two attackers on this knight, and it doesn't matter if the queen takes my a2 pawn now, because I'm going to win a piece. So I missed that because I didn't see the line through far enough. So I brought my knight back to d2 with the idea that, okay, if you're going to jump back, I'll jump back, because I thought this spot was a better, more active spot for my knight. And then my opponent starts to march pawns. I think he realizes his pieces aren't going to make progress, but we're heading towards an endgame, so at least getting pawns to have more activity towards promotion, that's a solid plan. Artisan, you're thinking that his knight can't go to e5. Oh, let me go back. Knight can't go to e5. And the other squares are protected by my bishop, so he can't exchange my bishop with his knight in the short term and enable his bishop in the long term. That queen perpetual, you consider g2, but they're all equal-ish, yeah. Yeah, share your ideas behind it. Yeah, there were a lot of kind of interesting, nuanced ideas in this position that I was very pleased when I put this game into the analysis today, that so many of the better ideas were ones I had at least considered. Because the worst thing is when you look at a game after and you're like, oh, ha, how about that? But now I feel like I have a foundation upon which I can build rather than just relying on an engine to show me the right ways. Knights are getting a workout in this game. Whereas this bishop, that bishop is on the couch. It is a potato. Has not moved. b7 was a terrible square for that bishop. I mean, and it doesn't have many better options right now because c6 is backwards. Okay, but I played knight d2 in game, g6, that's right. And finally, and only now, do I start to march my pawns, because I realize if he takes, I can take, and that's fine. This pawn that I guess technically I just isolated, that's not really a problem because it's a center pawn and it still is doing a job. I don't think this pawn's going to turn into a lady, but it is preventing horses from infiltrating, which is very important. This was a good move. And instead of taking, he pushes the pawn to b4, which is the best move. And I spent so long on this move because in my mind, I was thinking, sending a knight to b1, that is insane. I am undeveloping my knight to a starting square. What is a knight doing? What is a knight doing on b1? Well, the main job I needed it to do was to kick this queen out, because this queen, even though she doesn't have a ton of scope, the scope she does have on a2, especially now that there's a pawn on b4, this was so annoying because I can't move my queen without losing pawns. So I decide I need to kick black's queen out. Knight b1, best move. So the queen goes back to a5 in order to continue to have b4 having a touch point. Hello, hello. I'm reviewing a tournament game I played. This was a mistake. And I played the not best move. The next move, I was kicking myself because I saw that actually queen b3 is slightly better. And why is queen c3 slightly better? It prevents this pawn from moving anywhere. Kind of freezes it in place. But queen b2 is fine. And evaluation is still about +1 for me. Another reason that queen b3 would have been also slightly better is once the knight can reroute, it can't get attacked if the queen is on b3. Nice FIDE tournament. This one is USCF, so United States Chess Federation. So I kicked the knight out, and I completely and fully acknowledged the fact that it allows a hole for black's knight to jump into. But it was worth it, because I can easily move my queen. That's not a problem. And now this bishop cannot have the long diagonal. And more than that, if the bishop does decide to move, that pawn does fall. So this entire game, I've just been paralyzing that bishop. So the knight jumps not to the square I was expecting, but this is best move. And I'm making an accuracy here. My idea with this move is that I was a little bit scared of the b4 pawn. And I needed it to be gone, please, and thank you. Artisan, you're between liking and disliking the move c4. My thoughts exactly during the game. I didn't like that I had to play the pawn move, but it felt necessary, especially as we're heading towards an endgame. I had to consider my opponent's queenside pawns. So a3 was an inaccuracy. Bringing my knight to d2 would have been better, but I wanted b4 gone. And Artisan was asking before the game review whether there were any brilliance of the game. Here's the only brilliant in this game. B takes a3. I caught this before I played a3, by the way. I knew that it was his strongest move. And I knew that I could not ever consider taking the bishop in reply. Technically, the bishop is undefended, which is why this was a brilliant move. But if I take this bishop, this pawn is unstoppable. So my goal is accomplished because I can take that pawn, and now my opponent has split pawns to my two connected central pawns. And I thought that heading into an endgame, if we can get the queens off the board, I liked my odds. The only problem is that my central pawns are on dark squares, and my only protector would be a light squared bishop. So it's not a clear win. Can't play queen takes a3. Yes, I knew my only move was to take with the queen. Let's follow through what happens if you do take or take with the knight. If I took with the queen, my knight is gone. I caught that all in the game, which is why I knew I had to take back with my knight. So after my knight takes that pawn, queen offers a trade. And I say, heck yes. And we're officially in an endgame. Evaluation dead equal. 0-0. So at this point, I was thinking to myself, my d4 pawn is so vulnerable. How on earth do I make sure that it doesn't fall to give black a strong advantage? So I made an inaccuracy here. I moved my bishop from f3 to e4 with the idea of getting it to b1, preventing the knight from coming in and targeting the d4 pawn. And I knew that my opponent's next move would be to kick my bishop, but in the game, the judgment call I made was that I didn't mind that because it helped me get to my preferred square. But I think the reason this is inaccurate and slightly advantageous for black is that because we're in an endgame, marching pawns is good for the side that is marching the pawns. And yes, my bishop gets to an important defense square, but it does make my piece slightly less powerful in anything but a defense role. So the stronger ideas here would have been to just bring my bishop back to d1 to start with, because this is the only square that like I have to worry about short term. Yes, there's this for now, but there are options. But I ended up playing bishop e4, and opponent does play f5. I get my bishop to b1 like I wanted to, and black starts bringing his king. And I make a mistake here. We talked about this move before my stream died, RIP, of f3 was a mistake. I thought it was helpful to help prepare g4, but it's not helpful because I think a couple reasons. It's too slow, and if this pawn ever moves, it becomes a target, or it could just become a target this way. So the stronger move would have been to propose a knight trade, because my knight wasn't doing a whole lot on a3, and if a knight trade happens, then I don't have to worry as much about my central pawns being on dark squares. And they can play f4, freezing the pawns. F4 actually wouldn't be a problem. Because I could bring my king up. Always good to think about what colors you want to play pawns in the minor piece endgames. Yes, and I'll admit, I was not considering the placement of these pawns. My entire focus and concern was over this very vulnerable d4 pawn, because the king can catch it, and if these pawns fall, I was so nervous about his queenside pawns. So in my mind, I was like 3-on-3, those are going to freeze each other. I don't need to worry about that. The game is now happening here. But that was a misjudgment from me. Because Amuser, we can actually see that f4 was played by black, and it is a miss. A much stronger move would have been to activate the bishop, which is on a terrible square and has been on a terrible square the entire game, whereas a6 for the bishop is much, much, much stronger. So I get my knight to a better square. That's right, we were talking about the very cheeky fork threat. Does g4 work here? g4 is not recommended. Yeah, that's a mistake. Because it allows this, and then I have split pawns, and these connected pawns are very, very, very formidable. So I ignored this and figured that long-term maybe I would get my king centralized, and then I could target this pawn. I wasn't worried about it short-term. I was still very worried about the d4 pawn. So cheeky move. Opponent at this point says, oh, it's too obvious. And I knew he had to account for this. And that's the only reason I made this move, because it forces him to take a tempo, and then my knight can get to a better square and have bigger and better plans. I'm threatening knight e5. Exactly. And that g6 pawn, if I can get rid of the g6 pawn, then my 3-pawn connection here is a lot more formidable. And if I have to split my pawns, then it's also a lot less scary to go into that pawn endgame. He marches his king, which is a good move. And I think this is where the stream really started stuttering. And I had to think a long time here about whether this pawn is actually free. It appears free, but it also allows black's knight to c2, targeting my d4 pawn. So how much do I care? And I realize I do have time to take the pawn, because even if the knight jumps in targeting this, I have some moves up my sleeve that can help protect this pawn. Better move, Krishna, would have been g4 at this point. King can still go to d5, but if the king goes to d5, why was I not concerned about that? Well, we can see that actually. The king goes to d5. That's what happens. And I realized that's okay, because I can move my knight with tempo, because it is attacking the bishop from d6. So sure, black can grab that pawn, but then I win the game. And if that were to happen, if knight were to, or king was to take and knight were to take, then this pawn is protected and I'm actually in pretty great shape. So I played knight d6, which I had accounted for when I took the pawn on g6. And finally, opponent plays bishop a6, which is a good move. Knight f5 just in time, and now I run. Yeah, so that was my plan. And another reason I wanted my knight on d6 is that, sure, I can let these pawns fall potentially, but it allows me my own side of the pawn race, because the problem with bishop a6 now, the top move is actually bishop a8, because now this pawn can't move. So the pawn that black is banking on for promoting, it has to spend a few extra moves. So at this point in time, I play knight f5. This pawn is now protected and cannot easily be attacked. I guess there's something like this, but that's too slow. And these are great question. At this point in time, I had 5 minutes on my clock. Until about move 20, or this is move 41, until about move 20, my opponent had used barely any time, and I was thinking. So my time usage was on the less good side, but there was increment. So at this point, I was trying to think a lot more quickly. Luckily, the position had simplified, so there wasn't as much material to keep track of. And at this point in time, my opponent thought a really long time. He reached his hand as if he was going to pick up the bishop, and I almost had a heart attack, because it wasn't until he reached his hand to pick up the bishop did I realize I had a mate threat. Look at this amazing mate, bishop f7. So when he went to go pick up the bishop, it just unlocked my brain and said, oh my God, yes, move the bishop. But I had to compose myself because I didn't want to give it away, because maybe he didn't see it. He almost moved the bishop, so maybe he didn't see it. And so I just stood, or, sat there very calmly with my 5 minutes on the clock and waited. Heart was like thumping, 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 thumping. Um, Mate in the middle. Yeah. So I was just like, exterior, cool, calm, and collected. Interior, it was just like a rage room of adrenaline. So he doesn't move the bishop. But in order to avoid bishop f7 mate, he has to deal with this diagonal. And there's a couple moves that deal with the diagonal. The strongest ones are one of these two king moves, because either of these two king moves allow the king to flee from the mate. And because I was kind of in a time pressure situation while he was thinking, I was thinking like, okay, what are his best moves? Are we sure that this would be mate? So I was fully anticipating one of these two moves to happen. Interestingly, bishop c8 is also not instantly losing, because you could block this way. And then my opponent plays his move. h5. Bishop f7, checkmate, and I won the game. Did he jump out of his chair? He was very frustrated because he didn't see it. I mean, obviously he didn't see it, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed for it. But yeah, I don't blame him for being frustrated. I would be too. But holy crap. Just thank you, Laszlo Polgar, mate in two puzzles, because realizing that this pawn is supported by this knight, these pawns are covering these two squares, this pawn is covering this square, so the only squares that needed dealing with could be covered by the bishop. And yeah, just wow, wow, wow. Would have been gutting if I didn't spot that. Yeah. Here's the kicker. Prior to his h5 mate blunder, the game is dead equal. It's 0.4 in my favor for white, but I only had 5 minutes on the clock, so it was very, very, very likely that I would not have had the time to correctly calculate how to win this race. So is a little bit of luck involved in chess? I think so. So I did play out some moves of... It is definitely easier for black to play, especially like all black has to do is move a pawn. So I played out with the engine, like what could have happened. And so if the king had moved to the best square, I grab the hanging h6 pawn. Bishop proposes a trade, and I cannot take that trade because the a7 pawn jumps 2 on its first move, which I had forgotten, so my king isn't fast enough. So the only piece that has any hope of stopping the a pawn is my bishop, so this trade is a no-go from me. So best move is to check the king to get the bishop to the correct side of the board. Pawn marches, but then there is time for the knight to come in, and oh, just so close, so close. But now I have 2 pieces defending a2, and I will have some time of some kind to march my own pawns. Position is still dead equal here. So perfect play in this endgame would have been a draw. And man, remember earlier I was talking about king activation? This would have been a completely different endgame if my king was involved, for better or for worse. Still black can get the bishop to d5, yes. So there is some maneuverability, but I think with all of those moves, I can start to get my king. Oh, here's a crazy thing. Yeah, best move is h4, king g6. We're just following an engine line now. And then engine's best suggestion, king h2, saying this isn't important anymore. This is the only way we're going to win the game. Very tempo to tempo ending, yes. So tail of the tape, let's look at a quick little review pane together. Look at this game. I played this game with 90% accuracy, and it was almost dead equal the entire time. We each had a couple hiccups that led to negligible advantages, and it wasn't until the final blunder at the end that this game went one way or the other. So I was so freaking proud of myself, because remember, I still didn't know my opponent's rating until I won the game and was marking my win on the pairing sheet. And then I saw he was 1700. And my little 922 self could never. If I had known ahead of time he was 1700, there were a couple points when I would have offered a draw. Amuser, I should share this with the Cramlings and try to get part 2 for free. That's not a terrible idea. W Anna Strat. Yeah, 90%. Like, I am so proud of this game because I played my butt off. My opponent played his butt off. There were some great ideas from both sides. We had interesting chess arguments to make, and it just came down to a blunder.